recording, and welcome everyone to this month's Marine Ecosystems team collaboration team meeting. Thanks for your patience as we got some technical issues underhand. We're very glad you're here. So just as some notes, please keep yourselves muted during the talk. If you have questions, either save them to the end or you can enter them in the chat. And we will post this recording after the presentation is finished in a couple of days. So just one more thing before I ask for roll call, and that is that IARPC is asking for input on accessibility for people with disabilities. So I am adding a link here in the chat. We would love to hear your feedback about how we can make these presentations in meetings more accessible to everyone who is interested. So please fill that out if you have any suggestions or comments. And then I think the last thing we'll do is if you can go ahead and in the chat put your name and affiliation, or we will see your name, so maybe just your affiliation, and if this is your first IARPC meeting, this will be great for us to capture in the meeting notes. And I think with that, Danielle, are you presenting? Who am I passing the torch to? Kathy, okay.
Yeah. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kathy Kuhn. I work with the Department of Interior BOEM, and I have the honor of serving as co-chair on this Marine Ecosystem Collaboration team with Danielle Dixon and Jackie Grebmeyer. And for those of you that haven't joined on any of these calls before, just a little bit of background on IARPC. IARPC stands for the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee. And the overarching goal is to bring together leaders from the 16 federal agencies, departments, and offices all across the US federal government to enhance research in the Arctic. And the collaboration teams are platforms that connect federal government researchers, non-federal researchers, and other stakeholders, including those overseas, to work together on pressing research issues, specifically on the Arctic. And the Marine Ecosystem Collaboration Team specifically is to increase our understanding of the structure and function of Arctic marine ecosystems and their role in climate science and advancing predictive capabilities. We typically meet monthly or at least 10 times over the year and feature different science projects and programs. And today's meeting will discuss bioacoustic research and information needs in the Arctic. And we'll start off with a presentation on BOEM's Center for Marine Sound. So today, presenting from the Center for Marine Acoustics is Dr. Erika Staaterman. She's a marine biologist within BOEM's Office of Environmental Programs, and she is one of the program leads for this new Center for Marine Acoustics. Erika, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Okay, here we go with the screen share. Let's see if I can finally get this right. Presentation mode. This, and here we go. Okay, you guys are seeing this, yes? Okay. Yes. So just to begin, I want to acknowledge I work within the BOEM Center for Marine Acoustics. We actually just got started officially a few months ago. So you may have known some of us. I see some familiar names here and some people on the line who know about acoustics. So I'll try not to make this too introductory for you all, but find the right balance. Several of us within BOEM have been working on acoustic issues for years, but we actually decided to establish this center in December of 2020, which means that we're building our capacity, we're hiring new people, and we're really trying to do this because marine acoustics has been a complex issue, not just for BOEM, but for many stakeholders for many years. And it's an issue that really isn't going away, even as energy sources change. It's a challenge that's shared across many countries and industries, and it's also been really fraught with conflict. And partially that's due to really strong stakeholder positions, but also due to some misunderstanding of the topic itself. It's a complex thing to explain. A lot of people don't quite get it. And it just has led to a lot of issues in the past. So we really, hang on, I'm trying to get this to not be full screen so I can still see you guys. Can you still see this?
No, we just see your camera right now.
It stopped completely, my bad. Okay, hang on. Get this to be big. There we go. Now I'm going to share this one. Sorry for all the back and forth. Just want to be able to see people. Okay, now that's good. Good. All right. So like I said, it's been a top environmental issue for BOEM for decades. It affects all of BOEM's programs. So we have our oil and gas program, our marine minerals program, and our renewable energy program. All of these programs introduce sound into the marine environment in some way, shape, or form. So it's an issue that, you know, affects all of the things we do. It's been a controversial issue that I said has involved different political levels, been subject to litigation and threats for lawsuit. The science and the management are important to a lot of different stakeholders. And like I said, the complexity requires really high expertise. So we decided to form the Acoustics Center because we needed to really bring in people with the strong expertise that could help us become really a trusted voice in the community. So that is sort of our tagline, is become a trusted voice on marine acoustic issues. And so this broadly just introduces the functions of the center. The biggest one is going to be to focus on underwater acoustic modeling. So we are hoping that we can go soup to nuts doing the entire impact assessment of acoustic modeling, which typically has been done out of the house, not in the house at BOEM. So we've had to hire external contractors. That's been challenging with different timelines and procurement needs. We really want to be able to bring that together so that we can, you know, focus on what we need to get done more quickly. On top of that, there's a number of other big goals. Staying abreast of the science. We know that the information is changing all the time. We're getting new information about animal hearing or effects of noise. And so we really need to build our capacity to keep better track of all that. With policy, there are definitely some acoustic policies that we believe are in need of more technical information. One example of that I'll be talking about a little later is our current analysis of high resolution geophysical sources. Those are typically not the deep penetrating seismic, but more shallow penetration type of surveys. And there's a lot of sources that are used there that really, we believe, don't have as big of an impact on marine mammals as was previously believed. And we are now bringing a lot more technical analysis to the forefront there to support that conclusion. So that's ongoing work with USGS and NSF to bring that to light. In terms of our strategy, we are going to be planning in 6-year time horizons. That's to make sure that we're kind of always looking over for the next thing of what's coming down the pike. And then finally, we are focusing on messaging and partnerships. So the partnerships thing is a big thing to mention here, since this is a collaborative group. You know, we can only get done so much, and we really need to be looking for those alliances in order to build capacity, get done what we need to get done. There's a lot of common ground among different federal partners and internationally, a lot of common knowledge gaps, things that we can collaborate on to really figure out this very complex problem. Okay, so I just want to go into a little bit of background about like sort of marine sound issues. Hopefully this isn't too introductory for many of you, especially looking at you, Catherine. But nonetheless, I wanted to bring this in. It's a good sort of intro slide. So like I mentioned, a lot of the BOEM authorized activities introduce sound into the marine environment, and this occurs across all the different phases, from exploration all the way to decommissioning. These are the ones listed here with different types of energy sources, but I've bolded the 3 that we believe are the highest impacts, and the ones that I'll focus on most in this presentation. The deep penetration seismic, pile driving for installation of structures at sea, whether that's offshore wind or oil and gas, and then explosives that are sometimes used in decommissioning. So just acknowledging that this is a problem, like I said, affects all of our programs at all phases. Okay, so sound in the ocean is inherently complex. It is influenced by a number of different factors, not just the characteristics of the sound source, but also the characteristics of the environment. So different components of bathymetry, water depth, water temperature, salinity, whether there's ice or not, whether it's windy outside or not, different properties of the seabed, the density of the sediment, all these sorts of things affect how sound propagates. And that's really important to get your head around when you're trying to model things, but it also is really important because it changes over space and time. So every patch of ocean has different propagation characteristics, which is again why this thing is so complex and so challenging to work with. So that's just one, brief mention there of why we need a complex acoustic modeling to get our heads around this. Many animals in the ocean use acoustic cues to communicate. So it's not just about the whales and dolphins, also the little guys like the fish and the lobsters. I'm gonna play a couple and you guys need to give me a thumbs up if you can hear these, okay? So this is a sound actually I recorded in Panama from the Bocan toadfish. It's one of my favorite animal sounds. Let's see if this works. Okay, nice. Yes, that is called a boop, a toadfish boop. It's very scientific. This is a spiny lobster rasp. Okay, sperm whales, echolocation clicks. Oops, sorry. This is Atlantic croaker. Appropriately named. This one, the Weddell seal, probably my all-time favorite animal sound after maybe the Bocan toadfish, but it's definitely my favorite marine mammal. Sounds like a spaceship, and imagine the sound under the ice. I mean, it's like really cool. Yeah, pretty cool, huh? That's just a fraction of it, but I'll let it go. And then finally, bowhead whales. Okay, so you get the flavor. So all these different animals use sounds for different functions. It could be predator defense, it could be finding food, it could be calling for a mate, attracting a mate, all these different functions across the animal kingdom, which is pretty amazing, and it makes bioacoustics a very interesting field. It just is, there's a lot to understand, and every time you put a hydrophone in the water, you hear something new, and often we don't know what it is, especially when you're dealing with fish sounds. I think the marine mammal sounds are a bit better described, but fish are really still, there's a lot of mystery fish sounds out there. So it's pretty fun. Okay, now getting into how this interacts with anthropogenic sources. So this figure, I know there's a lot going on here, but basically what we're looking at on the top is the generalized hearing range of most of these species groups. So this is not, these hard edges on the edges of the bars are not really hard in real life, but this is just the best visual way to depict this. But general frequency range of what they can hear, right? And then we've got on the bottom, the frequency range of a lot of anthropogenic sound sources. And the shading here roughly corresponds to the area of the dominant energy of each of these. And what you can see is there's a lot of overlap. So when there's overlap between a species that can hear something and a certain sound source, that's sort of step one in considering whether it might be of concern. If you have something like, let's say, fish and invertebrates down here below 1 kilohertz generally hearing range, and a side scan sonar, which is way up in the hundreds of kilohertz range, that's not really going to be a problem. The fish can't even hear it. So that's great as a first pass assessment. When there is overlap, then you need to keep thinking, and there's many other factors that affect whether an animal would be affected by that sound. It's not just about frequency. It also has to do with the temporal nature of the sounds, the amplitude, how loud it is, the signal to noise ratio, how close the animal is to the sound, if they're even overlapping geographically in space and time, and other things too about the species, like the behavioral context in which it hears a sound, or the overall vulnerability or sensitivity of a given species. We know that certain animals are just more sensitive and have shown stronger behavioral reactions than others. So again, it's complex, but this is a good sort of summary slide of that sort of overlap. Okay, now briefly, I'm going to go into, like I said, some of the biggest sound sources that we have to deal with at BOEM. So many of you may know this. I'm sorry if it's too basic, but just for your information, seismic air guns are the big ones. They basically are these surveys that go out, weeks, maybe even months at a time over very large spatial scales. And the surveys themselves can be huge. So the streamers that go out behind the source, these are hydrophones that are listening for the sound as they bounce off the seabed and come back up. Those can be 10 kilometers long. So the actual vessel plus the streamers makes a very big footprint. And because these are very high energy sources, the acoustic footprint is also very large. The geophysicists care about what happens when the sounds are in the seabed. They're reading the data. They're using acoustic as a tool here. So this is not a sound that's a byproduct. It's really a deliberately produced sound where they're using it to learn about the marine environment. The problem is all that sounds goes through the water column in order to come back up to the streamers. And that's where then we get involved and are concerned because the animals in the water column might be perceiving and being affected by these sounds. In terms of impacts to marine species, it's really, we've seen a range of impacts, and context really matters. For example, baleen whales seem to be slightly more tolerant to seismic air guns when they're feeding versus migrating. There seem to be different reactions for different species of fish, for example. So context and species do matter a lot. I'm going to move on just so I don't take too much time on these. Pile driving. So this is just a sort of a schematic diagram of what it's like when you drive a pile into the seafloor. You have some sounds coming directly off of the pile, but then you have a lot of energy that goes into the ground and is radiated back out some distance away. This is this re-radiated path. And actually, this is an area of concern because we just know so little about it, of how the sound actually travels through the seabed and then comes back out and may affect benthic organisms in particular that are laying right there on the seabed or are burrowed into the seabed. This also makes it challenging to use, well, so there are certain noise quieting technologies that are typically used with pile driving. And actually this figure on the right here shows the relative level of noise reduction from different methods. So you notice that the 0 scale, then it goes negative. That's because it's a reduction in noise from an unmitigated source, unmitigated pile driving. And I apologize for these acronyms here, but this is a bubble curtain, a double big bubble curtain. I forget what HSD stands for, but these are all, this is from a European report where they were comparing the effectiveness of different mitigation methods or quieting methods for pile driving. And many of them are quite effective, but they're not effective at all frequencies. And they're actually less effective at low frequencies, which is a real bummer because a lot of these animals communicate in the low frequencies. So that is still a big challenge. The other thing I was going to say is some of these mitigating methods. And Matt, can you guys see my mouse? Someone give me a thumbs up. Moving on the screen? No? Okay. Well, so somewhere between where the sound waves go into the seabed and then radiate outward, the bubble curtain's probably going to be somewhere in between there, right? So that's the problem with this re-radiated sound, is that it's not usually captured within the bubble curtain. So that is still a problem where we're trying to get our heads around how you can really mitigate those sounds at greater distances. Another thing worth noting, this time series across the top here, this upper right figure, basically shows how a signal, which is considered to be impulsive at the source, that means it has a very high rise time, very high energy signal, becomes smeared out in time. And that's because of the nature of propagation in the ocean. You have these different paths from the sender to the receiver. The sound may bounce off the seabed and off the sediment a few times. And so it smears out the signal in time and makes it less impulsive, which therefore means less injurious or dangerous to animals' hearing systems, but it still is a pretty loud sound even at distance. So there's a lot of complexities of this, and trying to understand that distance at which a sound goes from impulsive to non-impulsive is a challenge. Okay, I think that's enough for that. Finally, I'm going to move quickly through explosives because I'm keeping my eye on time. BOEM does use explosives for certain things. It's usually used in decommissioning, and that would be usually the explosives are placed below the mud line. So there's a lot of attenuation that through the seabed, and a lot less sound is going into the water column as compared to open ocean explosives like what the Navy might use. But nonetheless, they are pretty loud, impulsive sources. And the water depth really plays a big role in the way that the sounds propagate here in particular. BOEM did just create, BOEM and Bessie created this underwater calculator, which is a way to predict potential impacts from explosives, which has really become like the gold standard for looking at explosive removals. So that's a tool that we can turn to. I was not involved before my time at BOEM, but it's just completed now. Yeah, I'm gonna skip through the figures. That's just some general info. Okay, and then finally, I mentioned this at the beginning in terms of the policy improvements we're looking at. We are currently in the middle of an analysis. We're close to the end. It will become a peer-reviewed paper in the near future, as long as it's accepted, looking at impacts of high-resolution geophysical sources. So what we're looking at here on the x-axis is the frequency, and then on the vertical axis is the RMS sound pressure level. That's a source level of these different HRG sources, and the boxes here kind of cover the range from these different data points. All of the data are taken from a report from Crocker and Fred Antonio from 2016, which BOEM co-funded that work. But the point of this figure is you can look at some of these things and immediately chop things off from areas of concern. For example, if you're concerned only about fish, right? And you know that they communicate or can hear up to maybe 2 kilohertz, 1.5 is about the range. You're already going to cut out impacts, like I said before, from these multi-beams or side scan sonars that are just out of their hearing range completely. If you're thinking about marine mammals and you say 180 kilohertz max hearing range, some of these highest frequency side scans are also not of concern. Then you can also think about the horizontal line here of, imagine drawing a line at 160 dB. That's considered to be the behavioral impact threshold for marine mammals in RMS. Anything below that would then sort of fall off as not of concern, because if it's 160 at the source, by the time it propagates out even just a few meters, and a marine mammal might encounter that, it's already at the level of not concerning, meaning it's not going to lead to a significant behavioral impact, though it could be audible. So audible and behavioral impact are different things, and I'm going to get to that in the next couple slides. But point of this is, I just want to let you all know we're in the midst of this analysis. It's not just about these two axes here. There's a lot of other factors that we're also looking at, including things about the duration, the duty cycle, the beam width. A number of these are very narrow beam sources, which means the likelihood of an animal encountering the strongest beam head on from one of these, it's a very narrow beam, is also pretty low if you think about a sphere of water around a source. So we're looking at all these things, and we are generally coming up with the conclusion that many of these sources could be considered de minimis for marine mammals, meaning that they're unlikely to result in incidental take, given the thresholds we currently have in the US. Okay. Oh yeah, this video. Okay, I hope this plays. So this is a good overview now of how BOEM generally has done its impact modeling for acoustics. So it gives you the context of the different pieces we bring together. Like I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of this has been done out of the house. We have not done this in-house yet, but we are aiming to bring it in-house moving forward. So it'll be the same basic building blocks, but done within BOEM in our new Center for Marine Acoustics. Okay, let's see if this works. Someone give me a thumbs up.
All marine mammals use sound in their lives to communicate, navigate, find food, detect predators, and maintain social networks. The sounds they produce have different acoustic qualities like duration, loudness, and pitch. For example, dolphins produce high-pitched sounds to find their way around, while large whales produce low-pitched sounds to attract mates.
Oh no, what happened?
Human industrial activities introduce sounds into the ocean. For example, shipping vessels produce sounds as a byproduct of their movement, while other sounds are more deliberately produced, like pile driving used for construction activities, and seismic air guns, which produce short pulses of sound that bounce off the seabed, providing information about whether there is oil beneath the ocean floor. So what is the impact of these sounds on marine species? The answer depends on a few factors, like the type of sound, how well the animal can hear the sound, what it was doing when it heard the sound, and whether it associated the sound with something harmful or benign. In some areas, like busy harbors, the noise from boats is so prevalent that it can interfere with animal communication. Scientists are busy trying to understand the influence that these different kinds of sounds have on marine mammals. Meanwhile, to predict potential impacts to animals, managers use models that include 3 components: when and where the sounds occur, when and where the animals are located, and how well the animals can hear the sounds. To build these models, we simulate the acoustic environment using information about the type of sound, water depth, and temperature and salinity of the water. We then include information about the density and distribution of animals to predict where they will be at any given time. Once we understand the overlap between the sound sources and the species of interest, we consider their hearing abilities to determine how much an animal could potentially be affected. The final step is to consider the vulnerability of the species based on other biological factors, like the health of their population, their mating periods, and their migration pathways, to evaluate how sensitive it would be to the additional stressor of man-made sounds. By considering the vulnerability of the species and the severity of acoustic impacts, we can evaluate the relative risk of man-made sounds on different marine mammal populations. From this analysis, we determine if an activity is too risky or whether protective measures can be put in place to adequately reduce the risk. After all, the more we know, the better we can protect marine life. All marine mammals.
Okay, so that's the overview. This just shows the different building blocks that were mentioned in the video. I'm going to skip this because I don't think we have a lot of time, but point is we're going to be doing this all in-house moving forward. It's going to take us a few years to get the model up and running, but once we do, we're hoping to be able to go all the way from the beginning to the end, getting to the total sort of level of conclusion of how impactful certain activities will be, providing our own risk assessment. So it doesn't just come down to the number of takes that are calculated from a model, but it really is a more comprehensive look at the whole species vulnerability. All right, real quick, I did mention behavioral impacts are not the same as audibility. This is a little diagram folks have used many times over. It's not original to me, but the idea here is that you have a sound source, and really close to the sound source, you're going to have that area where there could be auditory injury to certain species. As you move further away from the source and the sound attenuates, you're going to have lower level impacts, like potentially behaviorally significant ones, like a change to migration or feeding patterns or something like that. And then going even further out, you get to the zone of audibility, where an animal might detect the sound but not really be bothered by it. I want to note that in terms of reducing impacts, using any technology that quiets the source right at the source is going to be the most effective to close the size of all of these zones. So on the one hand, yes, you can monitor and you can watch for marine mammals and have shutdown zones and things like that. But if you're reducing noise at the source, that's going to help across the board. So that really is like the best possible mitigation method. Also worth noting that this sort of borderline of where a behaviorally significant or biologically significant behavioral impact occurs is very challenging to measure and show quantitatively. So that is a real area of growing research and a very important one. Also, in terms of the monitoring for mitigation, the different methods that folks use to look for marine mammals or other protected species, turtles and things as well, out on the water, really they're only as effective as their detection capabilities are. So there's limits to a lot of these. There's pros and cons. So for example, visual observers are great during the day and in good, nice, calm seas, but as soon as it turns nighttime or the seas get too rough, they're not going to be very effective. Passive acoustic monitoring is good for detecting the presence or absence of an animal, but it doesn't give you usually a sense of how many unless you have an array. And you know that has some limitations. Thermal cameras are now starting to be used. Those have a short detection range. Drones can survey areas, but they have limited battery life and you need a pilot. So, you know, there's trade-offs to all these things, but I do think that when used together, a lot of them are quite effective and are going to be probably what we're going to need to do, especially for this growing offshore wind industry on the East Coast where the right whale lives, and there's a lot of conflict around that, and there's going to be a lot of mitigation required. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the Arctic ecosystem in terms of acoustics. Some of you may already be really familiar with this, but just briefly, it's a really unique environment up there because of the ice and the very sharp sound speed profile. What this means is that basically there's a duct that can trap certain sounds and sort of preclude the transmission of other sounds. And so this means that there's sort of increased transmission loss at large. You also have, I'll get to this in a minute, a lot of seasonal phenomena, but really briefly, I wanted to show, these are called the Wenz curves. They basically show frequency and on the x-axis and amplitude on the vertical axis. And each of these curves sort of show the typical spectral levels of these different sounds. The numbers here with these black lines are for different sea states. And the sounds of ice breaking and forming generally falls in this middle green blob here. So it's typical of the same sort of range you'd see for different wind speed. Then you have the sounds of ice breaking ships, for example, which can be quite loud in the low frequencies that's shown in red. These are just some examples, but it's really more interesting, I think, to look at some seasonal phenomena. So actually, Catherine, I emailed Manolo to ask if I could use this data because he had given a slide a few years ago, I think. But if I'm interpreting this right, and you can correct me if not, what we're looking at on the bottom here is the percentage of sound files that had certain sounds in them. So we've got vessel noise and bearded seals, for example. And then the blue line shows ice cover. And so what you can see is some seasonal patterns very clearly, where bearded seals are clearly active in the winter, even when there's ice there, whereas you have the vessel noise that's more present in the summer months when you have open water. Also in the winter, because the ice cover is there, you don't have as much of the wind generated noise, which is typical for open ocean conditions. So it's actually quite quiet in Arctic environments and the Antarctic in the winter when it's covered in ice, minus the bearded seal activity. Then in the spring, the ice starts to melt, things start to crash together. This is a little diagram here showing the physical mechanisms of ice breaking, and that's actually a pretty noisy phenomenon. So you have a lot of that going on in the spring and summer. And then you have more biological activity too, as animals come through on their migrations. And then of course, the vessel noise begins when the vessels come through. So there's just, the point is there's a lot of seasonality in these Arctic soundscapes, which makes it very interesting to study. It also presents some challenges moving forward in the future with climate change and other trends. So I wanted to just show this slide, which basically shows with the decrease in ice over time, you see an increase in vessel traffic. So as I think we all know, that there are more and more folks looking at getting across the globe through the Arctic. So not to mention the cruise ships and other things. So this is a definite concern and something to keep an eye on. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Okay, I should have probably cut all the text on this. I really just wanted to show you there's sort of four main bins of categories of BOEM studies related to acoustics. First is using acoustics as a tool to study the environment. The second one is looking at hearing capabilities and behavioral impacts of different sound sources. The third one is sound source characterization. So how do we understand and better interpret the actual sources of different anthropogenic sounds? And the final one, which we're doing more and more of, is this sort of soundscape and acoustic ecology type work. I'm going to go into a couple examples. One of the big ones was this chaos study that was done from 2010 to 2012, where they had a whole lot of acoustic recorders as well as visual observers, huge effort, plankton toes, a lot of things going on. Up in the map shows the area of effort here and some of the team. And essentially what they were looking at is this variability in the Arctic acoustic environment over space and time and how it relates to animal migrations and all these other things, creating a Chukchi noise budget, which I think is a really cool concept, and looking at with predictive modeling how that's expected to change in the future with different climatic conditions. So this is a real landmark study that BOEM did. The report is quite extensive. I just wanted to show a couple of little tidbits of what it got into. And so you guys should definitely check that out. A couple of other ones that were notable, the early work on looking at bowheads' response to seismic air guns by Richardson in the 1980s. That was really big, where they were the first to really do experimental work up there. And then more recently, Susanna Blackwell's work with the bowheads, where she was able to demonstrate an increase in calling rate with the approach of seismic air guns, and then a plateauing and then a decrease. So what this figure shows is the number of calls that were detected over periods, 10-minute periods. And you can see that, and the receive level is on the horizontal axis. So at lower receive levels, there's less calling activity, but the animals increase their call rate, suggesting that they are responding behaviorally to the presence. They can hear the air guns, they're trying to call over them, right? They do this to an extent, but then when it gets to just be too noisy, they drop off, almost like they've given up on calling. So this is a really interesting behavioral result and a real notable study. And then one that's ongoing now, just for folks' awareness, BOEM is currently funding a three-pronged study looking at baleen whale hearing, which is a huge knowledge gap shared across all countries in the world and all the baleen whales. We really don't have any substantial data to hang our hats on. So there's a lot of proxy species being used in our modeling and our impact assessment. And we're currently funding a three-pronged approach where we're doing these three methods, looking at behavioral response study, as well as some anatomy modeling from gray whale skulls. And in addition, some hearing tests on juvenile minkies currently taking place in Norway. You may have heard of this because it made some press recently, where they're trying to do AEP tests on minkies in a place in Norway. So we are really hoping we get some data from these three distinct studies. It's ongoing and we probably won't have results for a few years, but stay tuned on that. Okay. I have a few more slides. I know I'm taking a lot longer than I expected. I wonder if I should cut any. I have a few I want to talk about with ongoing work in the Arctic related to acoustics. Oh, this one, Kathy, I'm going to go, okay. This one is a study idea that Kathy's putting forward in our next year's study list, essentially trying to build a coalition of folks looking at this overlap between vessel traffic, vessel impacts, and marine mammal species hotspots. And the idea here is to bring together a cohort of different folks from different tribal communities, subsistence hunters, and co-management bodies to identify the priorities, and then looking at vulnerability of these animals when it comes to not just vessel noise, but also vessel discharges and vessel strike. And then to really engage with the different entities to come up with the right conclusions and make some advice for how to interpret the findings. So this is a study concept for the future. All right, and then this is what I really wanted to get to. So just for your awareness, you all may have been aware, I think maybe Jackie was talking about this at the beginning of the call, a few things going on. So first of all, there's a state of the knowledge report from the BOEM group. I think that's how you say it. This next slide gives a figure showing it. So this is their cover slide on the left here. This was from 2019, looking at sort of overall trends in noise in the Arctic. And then this one from just came out last month about noise pollution in the Arctic. That was a modeling study they did that is showing all the main hotspots of noise in the Arctic from shipping in particular. Then the second phase of that effort is to come up with monitoring plans and decision support tools for regulators focused again on the shipping noise issue. So that is ongoing and people are discussing it. I'm not part of any of those work groups, but I have heard about them through the grapevine, and I'm sure there's a nexus with you all. Then there's this JPI Oceans effort, which I just heard about and have not engaged with yet. So this is led by Italy, supported by the EU, and they're currently looking for other partners. Their idea is to put out a call for funding for projects where they're going to look at effects of noise pollution in a multi-stressor context, and then also to think about quieting technology specifically for seismic. So this is ongoing. I don't quite understand what they're looking for partners, but I believe they have funding and they're trying to put out a call for proposals. Again, I'm not the expert on exactly what's going on here, but I'm trying to wrap my head around these multiple things because people really are starting to talk more and more about this issue of noise in the Arctic. And then finally, I wanted to mention it's more international focused and not just Arctic, but the UN Decade for Ocean Science, they just endorsed a research program idea for the maritime acoustic environment, we're calling it. And this came out through a SOST group that I sit on in the US. But the idea is to really build alliances and build this sort of international community of folks focused on this ocean noise issue. It kind of exists in many fora, but not one big thing and not with that UN endorsement. So I think what they're trying to do is really bring that all together. Okay, I showed this already. This is just a figure from that shipping report where you can see some of these hot spots, especially changing over time. So we've got March on the left here and then September where there's less ice and a lot more ships. So I think that's a very compelling figure. And then here on the top and bottom, the top is under open ocean conditions and the bottom is with ice. So you can see that the propagation is much greater when it's open ocean than the ice. All right, and so I will wrap here. Basically, I thank you all for listening to me explain what the CMA is and what our goals are, and then hopefully I gave you a good little flair of some of the marine acoustic issues we deal with, but there's a lot to say, and I know I'm going fast. But this is a top environmental issue for BOEM and will continue to be, even as administrations change. We really want to dig in and become that trusted voice in the community. So we hope to do that, and you guys will have to see the proof in the pudding as we go along here in the next few years. And I do just also want to emphasize there really does seem to be this growing focus on Arctic acoustic issues. So not just the science and the interest, like those seasonal trends and things I mentioned, but really the issue of the increased vessel noise and decreased ice cover. So that is ongoing, and look for collaboration in any way I can help. And that is all for me. I will stop now. Sorry I went so long.
Thank you for that really great overview of both the CMA and some current issues relating to marine sound in the Arctic. And I see a lot of accolades of saying mutual thanks in the chat. There are a couple questions, and then I want to leave it open for some broader discussion. One question is from Karen, is how do active bioacoustics and current profilers fit into the graph of acoustic sources and animal detections?
Yes, thank you. That is a good question. So I think so you might mean animal telemetry, like tags, like Vemco tags? No, you mean like echo sounders looking for fish in the water column?
Active bioacoustics to,
yeah,
or 80 acoustic Doppler current profilers. Am I real?
Yes.
I know what the frequencies are, but they're not very loud, I don't think. So I don't know how that all fits
So
together.
that is getting kind of lumped in with our work on HRG sources, even though those aren't really HRG. We do have a category talking about scientific sonars in that paper that is forthcoming. And the conclusion is that those scientific sonars, we believe, are de minimis for marine mammals because of their either combination of short duration, low amplitude, narrow beam width, all high frequency. It's a combination of factors that can render something de minimis, not just one. But that is the conclusion we're generally coming to. So I don't think, based on my professional opinion, the colleagues I've been working with on that we need to really be worried about these things for marine mammals. And the whole thing with that paper is really, let's focus on the most egregious sources, because in the regulatory community, we and NMFS and others have spent a lot of time on things that are generally pretty low impact. And we have a lot of bigger fish to fry, including this major growing offshore wind industry. I mean, not that it's all about the wind, but there's a lot of bigger sound sources out there that deserve more regulation. And then the little ones, really, we just don't have enough time, nor do we think they're that impactful. So.
Interesting perspective. I see another question here from Jackie, just asking a little bit more about the CMA, just where is it located and how many people do you have on staff, and or what's the vision for the future?
Yeah, so we are based in our Sterling, Virginia office. That's the BOEM headquarters office. We currently have 3 acoustic modelers, well, 1 who starts next week. And then I'm currently the only bioacoustician, but we have an offer out to another coming on board in September. We are then hoping to hire 2 more. So we would be a total of 7 with our initial phase of the CMA. However, if things go well and we continue to grow, and if there's interest from other agencies, for example, for us to do modeling for them, like a service type of arrangement, we may look to hire more people. So that would probably be a few years down the line. So for now, the short answer is we're looking to be 7. We're trying to get to 7.
Thanks a lot.
And say, okay, hey, Catherine, do you want to ask your question or do you want me to read it?
Okay, I can read it. Are you planning to do lab studies on benthic animals and fish? Yes, we have. Well, we currently have a study on black sea bass. I don't think they're particularly benthic, and fish, and pile driving impacts. That is ongoing. I do think that we're going to see more and more research coming out of BOEM on the fish and invert side. Not that the mammals aren't important, they are, but especially, like I said, with this pile driving and the issue of this re-radiated sound coming into the water from the sediment, it's a concern. We just know so little that I think we're definitely going to need some studies on that front in particular.
Excellent. And Jill, do you want to come online, or I can certainly read it?
Sure, I can come online for a second. I just putting on I used to work at NMFS in the Alaska region on Section 7 consultation. So this is all really interesting to me, and I was interested to see when the CMA was announced. And so I'm curious to hear about what the plans are of how the work of the CMA will work in concert with NMFS Protected Resource Division and the acousticians and the work that they're doing there, so that there's like a common agreement rather than, BOEM putting forth their impacts assessment and then NMFS, having a different view, and then the permitters stuck in the middle of how do we deal with this? So
yes, it's been,
yeah.
I know that those patterns have happened in the past, and we are trying to really break that mold and really get to a more collaborative place where we're going to bring NMFS in as we go along throughout building the model and getting input from external parties. Our sort of overall intention is sort of over communicate. So we're trying to really be briefing people regularly, having even a newsletter that's going to go out to different agencies and different federal partners, say, hey, this is what we've been up to, and come to us if you want to learn more. So we really do want to break that cycle. I will say that with this, that HRG de minimis work, we have been working very closely with NIMS throughout the process. And so our hope and intention, as they've been briefed as we've gone along, is that once this paper is published, it'll be kind of folded into their assessment. And there might be, at least for the MMPA, we've had pretty strong agreement. It's been a little more of a push and pull with the ESA folks, but we're still working through it. And we really are hoping that we'll get there and have agreement when things go out and hit the streets. So I hear what you're saying, and yeah, we're trying to do that.
Thanks. I'm happy to hear that there's already that involvement from the beginning with NIMS, so it'll help, definitely.
Well, excellent. Does anybody else have any other questions? I think we could probably, continue on for a whole nother hour on it, but I just wanted to capture as something else. Catherine has another question.
Okay, I can find my unmute button now. So it seems like a lot of the management of noise sources are based on a single source being out there. You can't exceed a certain amount, but there's a lot of places like in the Chukchi Sea where there was like 5 different boats doing seismic air guns at once. And like there's the cumulative effect of that and being able to actually mitigate each individual boat so that the collective noise levels are lowered. How are you guys going to approach that? I know with the modeling.
Yeah, that is very hard. I don't know that we are intending as of now to touch that when it comes to vessel noise. I think that is a huge problem that I'm hoping others in the community, I think, are thinking about or working on. But when it comes to, for example, pile driving or seismic air guns. So we have actually had a contract with we call them the EWG, this expert working group. Basically, it's Brandon Southall, Chris Clark, Dom Tollett, a number of others who have been helping us build this risk assessment framework, which we are almost ready to ingest and bring in-house to BOEM as part of this whole modeling thing. And part of what they've done is helped us to look at aggregate noise sources. So what happens if there's, for example, their current work is, let's pretend there's 2 imaginary wind farms on the East Coast. They're not using exact lease areas, but close enough. And what happens if there's pile driving happening at the same time in a particular season, and the animals are migrating between, and they're going to be exposed to noise in these different areas that aren't that geographically separated. So definitely close in time in terms of their migration. What does that mean for the overall risk to the species? And how do you contextualize that with all these other factors about the vulnerability of the species itself, not just the basics of how they hear and the sound source levels and things like that, but a lot of other biological factors. So they've been working on this risk assessment model framework, I guess you'd call it, for the last several years. And we are very excited to start using that inside BOEM to get a better handle on all of those things. Because that's probably the biggest challenge, aside from not understanding fully behavioral impacts and how significant they are. It's this cumulative thing that's a really hard nut to crack. So we're trying, and that's our approach as of now, but we're definitely open to any other thoughts or ideas because it's hard.
Excellent.
And Kathy, if you don't mind, I have a comment / question to chime in with too. I think, Erika, thank you so much for your presentation. It's really great to see the direction that BOEM is going with all of this work. And I'm excited to see the profile idea for the steering group that will bring in voices from Alaska communities too, to help provide some input about what's important. And I in most of the slides you presented, it seems like BOEM's focus, especially from a regulatory perspective, is impact on the marine mammals or the animals in the environment, and populational level effects and, that sort of thing. And it seemed like the model you illustrated looks at impact on a marine mammal, for example. And it seems like in most of, in a lot of cases, the impacts from sound may not have effects at a population level or even an individual level. But I wonder the extent to which the center will begin to tackle issues like what are the effects of these activities on coastal communities that are trying to conduct subsistence activities, because we've seen, especially in Alaska, with all the other changes going on with, changes in sea ice and weather, the window for conducting subsistence harvests for animals like marine mammals is getting smaller and smaller, and your opportunities to go out and hunt are that much less. And so I could see from a community perspective, the concern over, any sort of change to availability of subsistence resources that could impact food security for residents. And I don't necessarily expect a response right now. I know you guys are just getting started, but I'm really interested to see whether the center tackles that sort of thing in the future and how you do that. I think it'll be a really important question for Alaska. So if you want to respond to that, please go ahead. And if not, I had another comment about how we plan to follow up on this talk in our next month's webinar.
Sure, just briefly, it's a great point. I think that if we were to tackle that, we would need to then bring in some of BOEM's social scientists or even external experts, because I don't think our modeling team that's very acoustics focused would be able to take it to that next level. But if we could show impacts to the species or to the population, and then they could take it to that next level, I think that's how we'd probably have to do it. But yeah, point well taken, and we'll definitely think about that.
Thanks. I'm sure if there's time, folks can feel free to chime in next with other additional questions for Erika. I wanted to mention that as the co-leads for the marine ecosystems team, we were planning to follow up this webinar next month at the end of July with a webinar that will continue the series we talked about beginning this winter on how can we better work with the broader scientific community to design monitoring and modeling projects to also address applied science needs. And so we thought next month we might focus on the question of marine acoustics and try to generate some conversation in small breakout groups among folks who represent management agencies that are working on this topic, folks in the academic community that can contribute, and also hope to bring in some voices from Alaska coastal communities to talk about, what are the opportunities for win-win cooperation here, where we could use our science to address applied needs that, at all scales, including addressing coastal community concerns, and how could potentially cooperation with, for example, community-based observers bring in opportunities to collect data in space and time and closer to coastal communities where our typical studies funded by the agencies don't necessarily have that reach. So I hope that all of you will join us next month at the fourth Wednesday in July for that conversation.
That sounds great. Just another update. You had asked about the profile. And so in my update from BOEM today, I was going to just mention that we have our studies development plan online. And that gives an idea of what the different regions in BOEM are thinking about funding for FY22 and 23. So I put the link in the chat. And that's the update from BOEM. Does anybody, I know that we have like 2 minutes left. Does anybody wish to, Jackie, do you have any like summary comments or any updates in addition to the CAO?
No, the only thing I would say is on the international aspects, as I mentioned at the start of the talk, this is directly pertinent to the report that's going to be coming out from Pisces and PAIM to the Arctic Council. So we will continue these discussions. So it's great with this series of points that we're covering. That's all.
All right, great. And is there any, sorry, Erika, were you going to say something? I know that MPRV.
Yeah. Really quick, just related to what Danielle said and Jackie too, bringing people together for these smaller discussions. I would suggest you invite some of the authors from that PAIM report, the one of the shipping noise. I think it's the same one that Jackie's talking about, or maybe this other JPI Oceans thing that I got wind of. I don't quite know who the right people are, but if you want, I could try to find out because it seems like those folks should be involved in this conversation.
Thanks. Yeah, that would be great.
So any other updates, MPRB, do you have?
I did have one I wanted to share real quick. I'll try to screen share. I wanted to point out for folks that NPRB recently made an announcement about the anticipated structure of the synthesis and assessment for our integrated ecosystem research program. NPRB's been funding a large multidisciplinary program in the Bering Strait Chukchi Sea since 2016, and we're about to commit about $1.4 million to a synthesis that will follow it, as well as an assessment that will provide some input to NPRB as we begin planning for the next integrated ecosystem research program that will continue research in the Bering and Chukchi Seas that will be centered in the Northern Bering Sea. And so there's an update on the IARPC website about this, and I'll also put a link to the NPRB website in the chat where you can find this. But there's a lot of information here about generally how we plan to structure that call for proposals. We anticipate making about $1 million available for the backward-looking synthesis activities, and then about $400,000 available in 3 different categories to provide NPRB advice on the future program in the assessment category. And the reason we're advertising this now about the anticipated structure of that request for proposals is that we anticipate that we'd be releasing that RFP in early October 2021 with a deadline for proposals in December 15th, 2021. So it's a relatively short window of time between the time that RFP comes out and when proposals are due. So we wanted to give the scientific community a heads up as early as possible so that you could begin discussing potential collaboration with your colleagues. So this announcement provides more detail about the types of research we expect to come in under each of those categories. I just wanted to make people aware that it's out there. Thanks.
Well, great. Well, we've come to the end of our hour together. Please stay tuned for our July meeting. Look forward to future engagement and really appreciate your time today, Erika, and everybody for joining in.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Erika.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks, Erika.
Thanks.